It is fitting this Wednesday morning, as we convene a hearing on Greenland, that we have snow on the ground and ice surrounding us. Today we're here to talk about something that just a few years ago was treated as far-fetched, but has long been worth serious consideration: the potential of the United States acquiring Greenland. Back in 2019, President Trump raised this issue, the idea of purchasing Greenland, and at the time it was dismissed by some as outlandish. But given shifting global dynamics, the geopolitical importance of Greenland makes this conversation one we can no longer ignore. It's a topic of interest to members on both sides of the aisle. Indeed, the idea for this hearing was one the ranking member suggested earlier this year. Greenland has never been some remote island. It holds immense strategic and economic importance. Its location and proximity to critical transatlantic trade routes places it at the center of several global debates. The growing influence of China and Russia in the Arctic region, where Russia has long maintained military assets and China has invested heavily with a clear strategic eye, is a direct challenge to the United States and our allies. This deserves serious consideration and response. Greenland sits directly on the shortest flight path for intercontinental ballistic missiles traveling from Russia or the Middle East to the United States, making its positioning critical to our security. We have maintained a military presence in Greenland since World War II, particularly at Patuxent Space Base, which serves as the northernmost U.S. military installation and provides critical missile warning and space surveillance. The base, along with its deepwater port and airfield, is an integral part of our national security infrastructure. Also key to our operational presence and influence in the Arctic is a healthy number of polar icebreakers. The U.S. built its last heavy icebreaker nearly 5 decades ago. Meanwhile, China has 4, and Russia has over 40, whose warships increasingly appear near Alaska. The only operational United States heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, is 20 years beyond its service life. This is simply unacceptable. President Trump has highlighted the urgent need for a new fleet, and as chairman, I'm committed to ending Russian and Chinese icebreaker dominance. Executing on this quickly, not waiting for years and years on piecemeal annual appropriations, is vital for our national security, the economic productivity of Alaska and the Arctic, and our national shipbuilding capacity at American shipyards like Keppel-Anfels and Bollinger. But it's not just about defense. Greenland sits atop vast reserves of rare earth elements, materials critical for everything from technology to national defense. These elements are vital in the production of smartphones, military equipment, medical technologies, and much, much more. If the U.S. were to gain access to Greenland's resources, it could significantly reduce our dependence on foreign suppliers, particularly China, which currently operates a virtual monopoly on the rare earth market. Now, some may argue that the U.S. purchasing territory is out of the question. But it isn't unusual for us to do so. Indeed, much of the history of our nation was formed by acquiring territory. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with Napoleon, spending $15 million to purchase 828,000 square miles of land that ultimately became part of 14 states, many of which are represented on this committee today. From the Louisiana Purchase, we got portions of Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Minnesota, Louisiana, New Mexico, the great state of Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. Without the Louisiana Purchase, the United States would be a very, very different place than it is today. And then in 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia, spending $7.2 million for what became our 49th state, and what ultimately gave this committee Senator Dan Sullivan. And indeed, purchasing territory from Denmark is not unusual. The United States purchased the Virgin Islands from the Danish Crown in 1917 to secure a strategic military position in the Caribbean, especially to protect the newly opened Panama Canal and safe-time maritime routes from Germany at war with Western powers. The acquisition of Greenland is not about military force. It's about diplomacy and shared interests, the same way we acquired the territories that make us the nation we are. And let us not forget, friends and allies can have tough conversations. The U.S. and Denmark have a strong relationship, and discussions about Greenland's future do not have to be adversarial. If Greenland's future were to include joining the United States, that would almost surely require the approval of the Greenlandic people, likely through a public referendum. This would be a mutual decision, and it is one worth discussing. For Greenlanders, there would be many benefits of becoming an American territory, including American citizenship, including billions of dollars of new American investment in Greenland that would raise the standard of living of the 50,000 Greenlanders there today. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses about the national security and economic implications of acquiring Greenland and about the opportunities and challenges we face. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing on the Arctic and Greenland, Americans' economy, and national security. The United States is an Arctic nation. My colleagues, Senator Sullivan and Senator Murkowski, say that early and often. Senator Murkowski and I took a trip to the Arctic and Greenland in 2019 with several of our colleagues, and she has been a strong voice calling for a more robust American leadership in the high north. My state has long-standing ties to the Arctic. When you talk about 125 years ago in the Klondike Gold Rush and how everything sent to Alaska came through Puget Sound, the 200 vessels homeported in Seattle that are part of a multi-billion-dollar fishing industry in Alaska, there is a good reason that the Magnuson-Stevenson Act that is in place to protect U.S. fishermen is named after two senators who served as chairman of this committee. During the Cold War, America recognized that we had a vital economic and national security interest in the Arctic. Now, as climate change opens up new sea routes at the top of the world, we must do so again. New shipping channels could shorten shipping times between Europe and Asia by 2 weeks or more. Tourism, developing infrastructure could drive new economic opportunities in remote communities, and our Arctic allies could help replace China as the beginning of a new critical mineral supply chain for semiconductors, batteries, defense technologies. However, as the ice melts, we also face growing competition from our international competitors and adversaries. Russia and China are both increasing their military presence in the Arctic. I'm sure we'll hear about that today. Just last year, they conducted a joint military exercise in the Far East and Arctic. The reality is they want to be able to control the sea lanes, block freedom of navigation of our commercial and shipping and our military. They want to be able to tap into and sabotage undersea cables, and they want to move their stealth submarines and launch hypersonic missiles undetected. Russia is also engaging in illegal fishing in Alaskan waters and operating a shadow dark fleet to evade oil sanctions. And following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it became impossible to reach consensus on the Arctic Council. That is why I believe, Mr. Chairman, in partnership with Canada and Greenland and NATO, the U.S. must renew and recommit to an Arctic strategy that solidifies America's leadership in the Arctic. Instead of starting a new trade war, America must reinvigorate and expand cooperation with our allies, including Canada and other Nordic countries. We should be pushing to expand NATO's mission in the high north. With Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are now NATO members. Our good model is how NATO recently launched its Baltic Sentry operation, where allies work together to monitor and promote early warnings of threats from foreign adversaries and protect shared subsea infrastructure. I've encouraged that in the recent weeks. NATO Secretary General Ruth has called for a more proactive NATO engagement in the region to strengthen our collective defenses. The reality is the Arctic is too vast to police alone. It will take time and investment by both the U.S. and our like-minded allies to meet those threats from Russia and China. Russia has already more than 40 icebreakers. I'm so glad to hear the chairman's commitment to icebreakers. I'm sure Senator Wicker is too, a place where many of these icebreakers are built. While the U.S. Coast Guard only has 2 and the Navy has 0. Thanks to the bipartisan support of this committee, the Coast Guard will soon operate a 3rd icebreaker. But additional investments are desperately needed, the chairman mentioned this, to make even this 1 additional ship operational. Congress has authorized 6 more icebreakers, but that is still only a fraction of what is required. So I commend President Trump for saying that, quote, we're going to order about 40 Coast Guard icebreakers, end quote. We will need those icebreakers. In fact, I, 20 years ago, brought then Commandant Thad Allen to meet with several of our colleagues who were blocking these icebreakers. The future of the U.S. leadership, commerce, and security in the Arctic will require investments in these Coast Guard and military capabilities. We need shoreside infrastructure, including icebreaker home ports, new MH-60 helicopters, more C-130s, and P-8s in the region, and other Navy and air assets. That's the brawn. But we also need the brains to win the high north. So I hope this committee can work together to explain why massive NSF layoffs and budget cuts, because I believe they are short-sighted. For example, the University of Washington had a $400,000 study on how glacier breakups off the coast of Greenland contributed to coastal flooding, something I think we would all be interested in. This seems particularly short-sighted when we need to understand Greenland better than ever before. In World War II, it served as an essential refueling for military aircraft flying between North America and Europe. Cryolite mined in Greenland was used to make U.S. fighters and bombers, and during the Cold War, Greenland served as a home to the U.S. early warning network against Soviet missiles. Once we had 10 military bases in the world's largest island. Today, only the space base remains. The good news is if we stop talking about buying Greenland and instead work quickly to reestablish U.S. interests, there have been, I think since 1951, many update agreements between Greenland and the United States. The one most recently, 2018, I think during the first Trump administration. These agreements are in place that authorize dual-use investments, new port infrastructure, fiber optic cable, radar, and power plants. Over time, Greenland can be a rich source for critical minerals, but there are still high barriers to that development, something I'm sure we'll hear about at today's hearing. But we can also support the expansion of tourism and infrastructure with airports, roads, and hotels. And I'm sure, as our witness from the Wilson Center, Dr. Pincus, will point out today, Greenland has a tremendous untapped hydropower potential. Someday, Greenland could become home to data centers to give us the edge in the race for AI, and I plan to introduce legislation that would authorize the Department of Energy to provide feasibility studies on the development of Greenland's hydropower potential. I also believe that we should direct the Ex-Im Bank and other agencies to provide support for more U.S. infrastructure investments in Arctic nations like Greenland. And as I said at the last hearing, the United States needs to do more to improve our strategic investments to counter our adversaries. I believe cooperation is the best interest of the United States, and the Arctic is too vast to just police alone. Hopefully, these coalitions and collective defenses can help expedite the U.S. interests there. and support the scientific research and national security. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and continuing to make sure that America, maybe this Greenland incident, Mr. Chairman, will elevate this discussion that Senator Murkowski, Senator Sullivan, myself have been trying to get so many people to realize we are an Arctic nation, we have interests there, and we need to continue to move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. We now have 4 expert witnesses before this committee. First witness is Alexander Gray, Senior Fellow in National Security Affairs at the American Foreign Policy Council. Mr. Gray served as the Chief of Staff to President Trump's National Security Council from 2019 to 2021 and helped form the administration's positions on elevating the U.S.-Greenland relationship. Our second witness is Mr. Anthony Marchese, Chairman of the Texas Minerals Resource Corporation, a public company focused on rare earth production, developing one of the biggest deposits of rare earth elements in the United States. He has over a decade of experience in the economics of mineral exploration. Our third witness is Dr. Jennifer Mercer, Section Head for the National Science Foundation's Arctic Sciences Section. She has more than 10 years' experience in Greenland and more in Antarctica. And our final witness will be Dr. Rebecca Pincus, who is the director of the Wilson Center Polar Institute. She has focused her research on Arctic security and geopolitics. Mr. Gray, we'll start with you. You're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cantwell, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today on an incredibly important topic. My name is Alex Gray. I am currently a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. During President Trump's first term, I served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Chief of Staff of the White House National Security Council. Earlier, I had served at the NSC as Director for Oceania and Indo-Pacific Security, in which capacity I spent a fair amount of time working on China's relationship in the polar regions. My comments today will focus on the strategic and military importance of Greenland to the United States. Beginning in 2019 and continuing to today, President Trump has brought critical public attention to the question of Greenland's strategic significance in the Western Hemisphere and to America's national security. But it is critical to acknowledge, while that this topic has only recently gained widespread public attention, Greenland has long been a focal point for U.S. strategists looking to safeguard the periphery of our hemisphere. Before reviewing the history of U.S. interest in Greenland security and the threats that adversary influence or control of Greenland can pose to the United States, I want to make a general point about the ongoing dialogue concerning potential U.S. acquisition of Greenland. First, I do strongly support President Trump's stated effort to bring Greenland closer to the United States. As I'll mention in this testimony, the administration has several excellent options to do just that. Second, and I think this is an important point that has been overlooked, the current debate has unfortunately become centered on the Kingdom of Denmark, rather than on the people of Greenland themselves. Denmark is a key ally of the United States, both bilaterally and through NATO. Danish servicemen have fought and died alongside their American friends for decades in World War II, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. This debate, though, must move beyond U.S.-Danish relations, because that is simply ancillary to the larger choice facing the United States. Washington and Copenhagen are going to continue to be close friends, regardless of the ultimate status of Greenland. Put simply, and as embodied in Greenland's own foreign security and defense policy strategy that was put out last year, the ultimate goal of Nuuk is to obtain independence from Denmark. When this will happen is subject to debate, including in Greenland and Denmark itself, but for U.S. purposes, it is vital that leaders in Washington take seriously what the Greenlanders themselves are telling us and what the last several decades of increasing Greenlandic self-governance and autonomy demonstrate. Members of the committee, the question facing American policymakers comes down to the following, in my view. When Greenland inevitably obtains independence from Denmark, as their leaders again tell us that they will, who is going to greet them on the other side? Will it be Russia and China, with their history of predatory behavior in small developing states and their unwillingness to respect such state sovereignty? Or will it be the United States, with our commitment to sovereignty, the rule of law, respect for the environment, and for the rights and heritage of indigenous people? Now is the time to begin laying the groundwork for what arrangements can be put into place once Greenlandic independence is imminent. History tells us how critical this is, and I preview in my testimony going back to the 1860s, just how much the United States has focused on Greenland as a potential strategic threat if it is occupied or controlled by an adversary power. I would just highlight a couple things for these purposes. The U.S. actually occupied Greenland during World War II because it was so essential that we keep the Nazis from occupying it and being able to base U-boats from there, or potentially to launch bombers against the east coast of the United States from Greenland. The United States has attempted to purchase Greenland at least 4 times, depending on how you count, starting in 1867 and as recently as 1955. Administrations of both parties, Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, all seriously considered bringing Greenland closer to the United States because the strategic logic is so clear. The island has 27,000 miles of coastline. At its shortest point, it's about 1,100 miles of flying time to the United States. Over the past several decades, foreign vessels have repeatedly arrived in Greenlandic waters without proper authorization or in violation of NATO protocols. In one instance, a Russian submarine actually showed up in Greenlandic waters and was discovered by accident. Unfortunately, our friends in Copenhagen have not devoted the defense resources necessary to ensure that Greenland and the coastline and the airspace is protected the way that it should be. As during the Cold War, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap remains an area of considerable strategic concern for the United States as an area for submarine passage going to the east coast of the United States. And finally, the United States has a significant interest in the space base at Bitufik, which obviously remains one of only 2 U.S. Arctic facilities one of only 2 U.S. Military bases in the Arctic at that altitude that would serve strategic space interests, and there is no redundancy if we were to lose one of them. China and Russia have demonstrated their interest in finding weak spots in the Arctic in recent years, dramatically increasing their capabilities. China has preposterously called itself a near-Arctic power. It has launched a Polar Silk Road initiative with the intention to do in the Arctic what it has long done in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, undermine sovereignty of developing states at the expense of regional and global security. Finally, I would just mention a couple things on how the United States could best bring Greenland closer to the United States. We have a couple options. One, we could make Greenland a territory, an insular area. We have 14 insular areas in the United States: Guam, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, to name a few. That's certainly an option. They all have various levels of self-government. They have various levels, depending on Congress's intent, they have various levels of day-to-day autonomy. Alternatively, the United States could offer a compact of free association to Greenland, similar to what we have with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. This is, in my view, an excellent option, whereby sovereignty by Greenland would be maintained. At the same time, the United States would have a defense obligation and defense access to Greenland that would ensure that our strategic interests in the island are upheld. This would grant us also the right to deny military access to an adversary power who sought to use Greenland for its own purposes. While both these options present opportunities and challenges, the point I want to make is this, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member: the United States is running out of time to develop a coherent strategic response to an independent Greenland. The security stakes are too high to allow Greenland to obtain independence without a plan in place for the U.S. to ensure our core strategic interests are assured. As stated above, excellent options do exist and can be implemented given appropriate attention, focus, and will from the administration and Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Mr. Marchese.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cruz. Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to address Greenland's mineral riches and more specifically, excuse me, the potential development of a critical minerals industry. I'm Anthony Marchese, and for 12 years have been chairman of Texas Mineral Resources, a public traded company that, along with a partner, is developing the Round Top project, a world-class critical minerals deposit just outside El Paso in Senator Cruz's home state of Texas. Round Top's diverse array of critical minerals, when combined with my 30 years experience in the capital markets, I believe gives me a unique perspective on the discussion of Greenland's riches. As the world's largest island, roughly 1.5 times the size of Alaska, Greenland presents a mining conundrum. On one hand, it is a treasure chest of not only critical minerals, but base metals, precious metals, and industrial minerals. A map prepared by the government of Greenland illustrates the obvious. Greenland's entire coastline holds what is indisputably one of the world's greatest collection of minerals in one jurisdiction. Throw a dart at any portion of the coastline, and you will undoubtedly hit a potential world-class target. Conversely, the sheer topography of Greenland presents significant challenges. 1 mile thick ice in its interior, covering 85% of the country, winter temperatures averaging 16 degrees Fahrenheit, and thick sea ice, which potentially create clogged shipping lanes. While geological maps of Greenland present a vast array of critical mineral deposits along its coast, the presence of such deposits is only a starting point for exploration. Critical minerals vary in value significantly. Rare earth minerals such as cerium and lanthanum, although considered critical by the U.S. Geological Survey because they're part of the rare earth minerals basket, are not as valuable as neodymium and praseodymium, which are essential for magnets and batteries. Mineral characterization is essential in order to, quote, separate the wheat from the chaff, unquote, to focus on economically profitable deposits. Such characterization requires significant amounts of exploratory drilling. Drilling provides answers to questions such as, what minerals do we have? What are the estimates of the quantities we have? And what are the grades of the minerals we have? Drilling is expensive, and such costs in Greenland are magnified. Once mineral characterization costs are addressed, capital and operating costs of mining are encapsulated in a feasibility study. After receiving the necessary approvals and permits, the feasibility study requires drilling data, metallurgical data, processing cost data, environmental data, and finally, the downfall of many projects, commodity prices, or accommodating commodity prices. Mining in Greenland dates back into the 1950s. In fact, Greenland was at one time the world's largest producer of cryolite, a mineral used in aluminum production. Outside of cryolite, serious mining in Greenland commenced in the 1990s. Unfortunately, there has not been significant critical mineral mining in Greenland. In 2021, the government effectively ended a promising rare earth project because uranium would be mined as a mineral byproduct. As a result, Greenland banned uranium mining due to local indigenous opposition. Interestingly, a study sponsored by McGill University in Canada several years ago found that over 85% of the population surveyed favored mining, with the exception of radioactive materials. Without characterization, we do not know if future mineral deposits are accompanied by uranium, thereby potentially limiting development unless there are policy changes. An acquisition by Greenland by the United States could take many forms. I believe Alex just mentioned those. There needs to be a determination as to which regulatory authorities, if any, would govern mining projects. In the United States, the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forestry Service govern mining regulations on federal lands, while states like Alaska also give serious consideration to the desires of the indigenous population. At the present time, Greenland's 56,000 inhabitants are predominantly Inuits, an indigenous population which has a strong voice in environmental policy along with the governments of Greenland and Denmark. Regulatory authorities are critical to an examination of the economic incentives for mining. Characterization of mineral deposits is time-consuming and expensive, tantamount to venture capital investing. The USGS could provide government funding for such characterization to lessen the exploration risk for private industry. In this regard, it is imperative to remember that capital costs for Greenland projects are highly variable. Frigid winters create many restrictions, significant hurdles for timely project development. Lack of infrastructure such as roads, fuel, electricity, and housing exacerbate capital costs. Workforce needs would require the import of foreign labor, given that skilled mining labor is minimal in Greenland. Metallurgical expertise necessary to process mineral material would present further challenges, as such expertise is generally available primarily in Asia. Greenland's mining challenges would likely require the U.S. government to provide significant financial assistance in order to attract private capital, with funding needs required in both upstream and downstream development. Short-sightedly, current U.S. policy provides funding solely for downstream development, which has been a severe impediment to our own domestic production. In conclusion, mining in Greenland can likely attract capital by providing significant financial incentives while simultaneously aligning local politics and environmental regulations in an effort to create a supportive investment climate for private industry. Thank you for your attention and interest, and I am pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Marchese. Dr. Mercer.
Good morning, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Jennifer Mercer, and I'm the head of Arctic Sciences in the Office of Polar Programs at the U.S. National Science Foundation. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing to share the important research and collaboration that NSF is facilitating in Greenland. NSF has an important mission of supporting the U.S. research enterprise and fostering U.S. STEM talent. NSF's support of research facilities also establishes a U.S. presence in the Arctic and demonstrates our capabilities as a nation and builds goodwill with other nations. This research is important in the polar regions where, as you know, Russia and China are increasingly seeking to extend their reach. I oversee both scientific research conducted in Greenland and the research infrastructure that enables research funded by NSF, other federal agencies, and by international partners that advances U.S. national interests. I was born and raised in South Dakota and completed my undergraduate studies there. After earning my PhD in New Hampshire, I was a researcher at the University of Wyoming before joining the federal government, first in the Department of Defense and then at NSF. The first time I deployed to Greenland was 15 years ago, bringing with me a decade of experience as a researcher in Antarctica. And I'm excited to share with the committee why Greenland is so important to the U.S. science and engineering research enterprise. The polar regions have a long history with both U.S. scientific research and defense operations. Greenland was strategic during World War II and the Cold War for the U.S. and its allies. It was the site of Camp Century, where the U.S. Army established an operational base under the ice. Efforts like this taught us a lot about ice sheets and snow mechanics and how to operate in these extreme environments, knowledge and methods that we still use today in both the Arctic and Antarctica. NSF has an established relationship with the government of Greenland, which has authority over research there. All of the research activities that NSF supports in Greenland are conducted consistent with Greenland law and regulations. NSF collaborates across the U.S. government with the Department of State and several Department of Defense services. NSF funds the research capabilities as well as research projects on the U.S. Coast Guard's icebreaker Healy, which visited Greenland last summer. NSF facilitates research logistics in the Arctic on a cost-reimbursable basis for NASA, NOAA, and other agencies that are supporting activities there. U.S. scientific research spans from the marine environment to the coastal villages and towns to the top of the Greenland ice sheet. Today, about 80% of Greenland is covered in ice, and at its thickest points, it is nearly 2 miles deep. It is a massive feature that is important for understanding variability in the Earth's land ice and is an ideal location to study atmospheric circulation. Research in the coastal waters is important for understanding marine ecosystems, ocean circulation, and the submarine environments which support fishing and vessel navigation. NSF awards support upwards of 300 people at 15 to 20 research locations throughout Greenland each year. NSF's main operational locations are the village of Gangalusuaq and the United States' Pituffik Space Base on the west coast, and Summit Station and Raven Camp on the Greenland ice sheet. Raven Camp serves as a training site for the New York Air National Guard's 109th Airlift Wing that operates the ski-equipped LC-130 aircraft fleet, the only fleet of its kind capable of landing large loads of cargo and fuel on skiways. The U.S. is the only country with this capability. The LC-130 is the backbone of transportation within Antarctica and on the Greenland ice sheet. Summit Station is the only high-altitude, high-latitude, inland year-round research station in the Arctic. Summit sits at a physical elevation of over 10,000 feet. It was established in 1989 as an ice drilling camp. Year-round operations began in 1997, focusing on continuous atmospheric sampling and measurements. NSF is currently in the process of designing new station infrastructure for Summit, and this will serve as a hallmark of U.S. scientific research in the Arctic. NSF has approximately 75 active awards to U.S. institutions for research in, around, and about Greenland. The Arctic contains distinct physical features that allow for unique research opportunities with practical impact. And these are just some highlights of the important scientific study happening in Greenland, where the U.S. is a leader and a collaborator in research. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mercer. Dr. Pincus.
Committee, thank you for convening this hearing on the Arctic and Greenland. I'm honored to appear before you today as the director of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. In keeping with the nonpartisan, policy-focused work of the Wilson Center, I offer the following comments on U.S. strategic interests in the Arctic and Greenland significance. My bottom line up front is that the Arctic region, which has important and enduring strategic significance to the United States, has taken on an added measure of global importance due to its natural resources, emerging shipping lanes, and relevance to space issues. Greenland's importance is best understood in this broader Arctic context. The Arctic holds significant natural resources, including minerals, hydrocarbons, and fish. Emerging shipping lanes across the Arctic, including the northern sea route across Russia's coast and the Northwest Passage, are drawing increasing interest as ice coverage declines. The Arctic is also important to the space domain, since polar and near-polar orbits provide unique and valuable satellite views. Russia has core national security and economic interests in the Arctic. It is a region of top importance to Russia. China also has interests in the Arctic, including natural resources and emerging shipping lanes. China has no territory in the Arctic, and the region is outside core PRC interests. However, the complex and emerging China-Russia relationship plays out in part in the Arctic, and this makes China an important and influential regional actor. The U.S. established itself as the dominant polar power through significant effort and investment at the peak of the Cold War. Today, the effort that went into building U.S. leadership in the poles is at risk. The investments made in the 1970s are rusting away, and the U.S. faces a new and more complex global competition. Without a fresh wave of investment and attention, the U.S. will face severe limitations on its presence in the poles and could soon lose its dominant position. These weaknesses are apparent, and it is not surprising that U.S. competitors are leveraging the symbolic value of polar capabilities and operations to apply pressure on us. For example, China has leveraged its world-leading shipbuilding capacity to build a small fleet of research icebreakers, in contrast to the degraded condition of the U.S. polar icebreaker fleet. The Polar Star and the Healy were great ships in their day, but the Star is now 52, and the Healy is 28. The U.S.'s 10 ski-equipped LC-130s, which Dr. Mercer has already discussed, were built in the early 1970s, and they are all now 50 years old. These unique capabilities are approaching the end of their operational lives. Losing them would directly risk U.S. presence in the polar regions. When it comes to Greenland specifically, I would underscore that Greenland has enduring national security significance to the United States by virtue of its geographical position, and that Greenland's mineral resources have the potential to affect U.S. economic security. I would note that Greenland has other economic strengths that also merit consideration, and I'll offer a couple comments on each of those points. Greenland's long-standing importance to U.S. homeland defense and securing northern approaches is heightened by today's increasing activity by U.S. competitors and the prospect of increasing accessibility throughout the Arctic. The Batufix Space Base is a critical forward location to U.S. missile defense. Greenland provides the westernmost location for monitoring Russia's naval activities in the Arctic and North Atlantic. Other NATO allies are critical to this effort, and the U.S. enjoys strong defense relationships in and adjacent to the region. Denmark recently announced a $2 billion package of defense investments for Greenland, with a second tranche of investment to be announced this summer. Greenland has a rich endowment of minerals, as Mr. Marchese has discussed. Most are as yet undeveloped due to several significant complicating factors. The foremost challenge is the harsh climate and lack of infrastructure, which significantly raise development costs. Greenland's enormous energy potential is often overlooked. The island has virtually unlimited hydropower around the ice sheet. Its hydro potential is very high quality and offers the potential to co-locate energy-intensive industrial facilities in the Icelandic model. The cold climate in Greenland would make data centers an obvious choice, although this would require a fast fiber connection to the United States, possibly via the planned Far North Fiber project between Japan and Ireland, or through Quintillion's planned expansion. A fiber connection to Greenland would enhance regional security through a dual-use benefit to communications capabilities, and it would tie Greenland closer to the United States. Tourism is another significant area for growth. Starting this summer, United Airlines will offer direct flights just over 4 hours long from Newark to Nuuk. With tourism arrivals expected to double in the face of significant limitations on hotel availability and other support infrastructure, there is both a tremendous economic opportunity as well as need for strategic investment and development planning. Many of the challenges and opportunities we see in Greenland are echoed across the North American Arctic, including in Alaska and the Canadian Arctic. I welcome the committee's attention to this problem set and its strategic implications. The Polar Institute stands ready to support Congress's efforts through our research and analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you to each of the witnesses for your very informative testimony. Senator Sheehy is going to be presiding over the Senate in a few minutes, so he has asked if he can go first, so I'm going to yield my time initially to him and recognize Senator Sheehy.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks all of you for your testimony, very enlightening. For Dr. Pincus, a question directed your way. It seems like you have a pretty informed policy view on this. You know, the only constant is change. And right now we're seeing aggressive territorial expansion efforts from Russia, obviously through force. And China is literally building islands to expand its sphere of influence, not just in the South China Sea, but as you correctly pointed out, using every tool at its disposal to grow its influence elsewhere. I think the discussion we're having here is a common sense discussion about how we can maneuver ourselves to ensure that an extremely important piece of real estate, which at the end of the day is what we're discussing, whether it's data centers, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's shipping lanes, does not fall into the wrong hands. And from your policy perspective, what is the best approach? And I think then I'll move to Mr. Gray as a secondary. What do you think is the best outcome? What's the best approach to achieve what we think the best outcome can be so that we do not allow Greenland to become a territory of our adversaries in the very near future?
Thank you so much for that question, sir. I would say that from a policy analysis perspective, which is my background, the U.S. has a range of policy options in Greenland. The choice among them entails a consideration of priority, risk, and cost. And the President and Congress will make those determinations and set policy. I do think that a thorough review of various scenarios and contingencies would be worthwhile exercise to carefully review the range of possible scenarios for Greenland's futures and evaluate a set of options for the United States, again, along those parameters of priority, risk, and cost. We have heard that Greenland is in a global context in which we have options that span across the Pacific in terms of different approaches to our relationship with Greenland. So we have both a geographical span to consider here, as well as, I would say, an evolution over time. Greenland has been very important to the United States missile defense for decades. And so we have an enduring significance there as well. So I think thinking about sort of geographical span, risk over time, and then those questions of priority, risk, and cost would merit a very thorough review. I welcome this discussion here today, but I think a more in-depth analysis of the various options would give you better grounds for making those determinations. Thank you.
Senator, I agree with you completely that the threat is very real. And the threat of both Russian and Chinese penetration in Greenland, and not just in Greenland, but in the high north more generally, is something we have to be very attuned to. We've seen it not just in Greenland, but in the Faroe Islands. We've seen it in Svalbard. We've seen it all over that high north region. To me, the number one objective of the United States in Greenland has to be the same that it's been since the 1860s, which is to prevent, deny access and control to an adversary power who would use that space to threaten our homeland and our hemisphere. To me, the best way to do that, ideally, would be as an insular area of the United States, one of the 15th insular area that we have. Alternatively, if that was not feasible for whatever political or other reason, I think the alternative of a compact of free association, whereby critically we would have military access, but I think even more significantly, similar to our Pacific friends in Palau, RMI, and Micronesia, we would have the right of denial to deny formally and through a legal mechanism the right of a foreign adversary to use that space. I think that would be the ideal American solution.
What do you think that's not going to come for free. So what's that going to cost?
Well, I can tell you, sir, in the instance of Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, it does cost development assistance. It costs, in Palau, we have a trust fund that we funded for decades. It is on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. But I think, one, it solves a security dilemma that we have had for decades or centuries. And two, Mr. Marchese is much more eloquent on the natural resources side of this, but there are tremendous economic opportunities that I think can offset some of these costs if we do this strategically and thoughtfully. So I think I think there are ways to offset the cost, in short, Senator.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Ranking Member Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks for holding the hearing. And Dr. Pincus, so Greenland is a NATO ally, correct? We have military relationships now that allows us to be there, and we have all these other relationships that we could take advantage of, both on minerals. It's, to me, there's just a cheering section in Congress that wants us to understand the Arctic, and we've been yelling about it, I guess, or cheerleading for icebreakers for a long time, because it starts way over on our side of the country. Before you get to Greenland, we are seeing the intimidation, the activities of Russia and China as it relate to our fish, intimidation in our waters. And so for us, it doesn't start and end at Greenland. It is this issue you and others articulated of a melting ice that gives a Northwest Passage, that gives a whole new trend of interest. So, but when you think about what you mentioned, everything from, space to natural resources, what do you think is the most important thing we could do now to bolster that alliance? Is it a more broadened NATO agreement? Because with this Baltic Sentry operation where we're trying to stop what Russia is doing, is it some other capability right now on this communication issue? And then while I'm not against the mineral agreement or enhanced mineral agreement, it seems to me that the hydro relationship, given what Mr. Marchese said about the ice being this challenge, here ice is our friend, and ice is creating a ton of hydro. And if you do the sea cable, it seems to me like this is that getting a stronger NATO relationship, getting our expansive view of how this fits into the larger Arctic picture, and taking advantage of the easy layups would be things that we should do.
Thank you for that question, Senator. you know, again, I'll go back to my earlier point that the U.S. has a range of policy options. And the first step is to define the problems that we are focused on really carefully, because it's hard to talk about answers if you don't know, if we're not all in agreement on what the problem is. But I think—
I call that the correct environmental assessment.
But in terms of policy options, you know, I think, you know, the acquisition of Greenland is a really interesting option that deserves very careful scrutiny and weighing. I do think that it is a challenging option. I think there are some practical hurdles that would have to be overcome, and we can have a discussion about what those would be. I do think cost is an issue, but I think there are a range of options that, again, can be weighed against the problem, the risk we face, and our relative prioritization of it. And so if we put territorial expansion sort of at one end of the spectrum here, and then we can think about what might be smaller scale policy options that would be a less total solution, but might
Okay,
be—
let me ask you something differently.
Sorry.
If we weren't discussing Greenland and what the president said, would you be arguing for a larger NATO relationship and a larger Arctic agreement between the United States and NATO allies?
I think the NATO alliance is becoming more active in the Arctic region without that agreement. And NATO is a large alliance that moves fairly slowly. So it has taken some significant steps to be more active in the Arctic in the last few years, and that process has been balanced against the ongoing demands of the war in Ukraine.
Well, you could say we were slow on icebreakers too. So this is this awareness issue of we're trying to get the whole country to understand this challenge.
I will say that the US and Denmark have a bilateral defense agreement for the defense of Greenland from 1951 that did not include Greenland. That agreement was expanded in 2004, the Igalikuit Agreement, to better include Greenland's voice. But 2004 is 20 years ago, and Greenland has taken many steps towards independence since then. So a new, perhaps trilateral defense agreement that is responsive to US security concerns, as well as the new political powers that have devolved to the Greenlandic government, I think is something that in the short term certainly could also deserve some attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. Mr. Gray, if the United States were to go forward with attempting to acquire Greenland, it would likely require the active agreement of Denmark and also the vote of the people of Greenland that this was a mutually beneficial step. Let's focus initially on the first part. From the perspective of Denmark, what are the benefits to Denmark of considering this negotiation?
Well, Senator, I would say Denmark has failed, unfortunately, to provide the type of security that the alliance, that NATO, that we all need in the Greenland region, in the Arctic, for a long time. So having a U.S. commitment to take on some of that security burden would be beneficial to Denmark based on their behavior to date. I know they've recently increased some defense spending relative to Greenland. That's great, but we have a pattern of decades of neglect. So I would think that would be to their benefit. Look, I think the larger question here, Senator, is Denmark is not going to have as a constituent part Greenland over the long term. And so to the Greenlanders have made that clear. So the question is, what is the security architecture that's going to be in place at that ultimate point of independence? And it's not in Denmark's interest, just as it's not in our interest, to have a vacuum that is filled by China and Russia. And that's why having some sort of discussion about what comes next is so critical.
So if I'm understanding your testimony correctly, there are three principal benefits to Denmark of considering selling Greenland's territory to the United States. The first is that their existing defense obligations put significant costs on Denmark, costs that are a real burden to the government of Denmark and the people of Denmark. The second is if the United States were to shoulder the cost of providing that defense of Denmark would also significantly increase the defense defense of Greenland, rather, would also significantly increase the defense and security of Denmark, and limiting the role of Russia and China in the Arctic also inures to the defense benefits of Denmark. But number three, and this is an important point you made, we are seeing a growing independence movement in Greenland. If Denmark were to negotiate today with the Trump administration to sell the territory of Greenland to the United States, it would presumably be able to negotiate some substantial sum of money. That's how we purchased Louisiana Purchase, that's how we purchased the Virgin Islands, that's how we purchased Alaska. If Denmark does nothing and Greenland declares independence, then rather than getting some substantial sum of money, Denmark gets nothing. Is that a fair summary?
I think over the ultimate time frame we're talking about, Senator, that's true, because I believe we should take the Greenlanders at their word that they will be an independent country at some point. And ultimately, sir, it is not in Denmark's interest to leave a security vacuum in the high north. In addition to your point about the costs, they will suffer as much as anyone from having what I think is the 100% predictable outcome of China and Russia stepping into that vacuum if we don't have some sort of clear security architecture in place.
So I think that's very powerful. Let's turn to the benefit to the Greenlanders. And Mr. Marchese, I think if this were to proceed, it would in all likelihood require a referendum of the people of Greenland making a choice. Do you want to become an American? Do you want to join the United States as a territory or in some other legal structure? And there's been some chatter online about an early public poll that was done that suggested that currently Greenlanders did not want to do that. That does not strike me as terribly probative, given that this is the very beginning of a discussion, and any referendum would be made with the Greenlanders assessing, what do we get for it? What's our benefit? How are our lives better off? So in your judgment, how would the lives of Greenlanders be better off were they to become part of America?
Senator, I mentioned in my testimony that McGill University had done a survey of the population, and they were for mining. So I believe part of it is the recognition that were the United States to come in, more than likely, they would provide some form of financial assistance to allow private companies to come in and mine. And the vast majority, I think they said about 85% of the Inuits wanted mining, with the exception of uranium. That's a separate topic. The point is, I believe once the Greenlanders recognize that the United States would come in and provide a lot of assistance, that mining jobs would be there, and that's very important for the population. There just isn't that much mining right now, and I think that if there were the prospect of financial assistance to jumpstart the mining industry, I think you would see more Greenlanders interested in becoming part of the United States.
Well, we see significant discussion. I sat down this past week with the ambassador from Denmark and with the ambassador representative from Greenland, and one of the things we discussed is the very significant benefits that come with American citizenship. And I think, for example, of Puerto Rico, where the people of Puerto Rico enjoy a considerable upside from their current status as an American territory. And were Greenland to agree to this acquisition, the Greenlanders would get the invaluable asset of American citizenship, but also would benefit from billions of dollars of additional investment in Greenland to develop those rare earth minerals, the vast resources they have that are not currently being developed. Tell us, how would the investment increase, and how would that benefit Greenland and America if Greenland's status were to change such that it were part of the United States?
Senator, the first step, as I mentioned in my testimony, would be to actually provide, I believe the USGS would be the best forum or the best agency to do this, but with the USGS's assistance, undertake a massive mineral characterization in the country. Well, first of all, that in and of itself, it's not a short-term process. That's probably a few years to do that. That in and of itself would provide jobs for people. Remember, there are only 56,000 people there, so you don't need that many to be happy to have the entire country be happy. So the USGS comes in, provides some assistance to map, in essence, map the area to figure out which deposits are real, which deposits are not real. Once you do that, then you start getting into convincing companies to put money in, and that provides even more jobs. So I think even before you start putting a shovel in the ground to create a mine, you have, in my opinion, the potential for thousands of new jobs in a mining industry. I mean, at the end of the day, Greenland, in my opinion, can become with obviously responsible environmental oversight, can become a major international producer of all types of minerals, not to mention, as Senator Cantwell said, a potentially large hydro industry. And that in of itself requires, forget about rare earth minerals, but as an example, the hydro industry would require a tremendous amount of jobs. But remember, the expertise has to be developed also.
So there are potentially massive economic benefits.
I believe massive potential.
Senator Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gray, I would like to start with you. You talked about two different ways in which this might proceed, about Greenland becoming an insular area or a COFA agreement. I just wanted to ask, does that mean it's safe to assume that you don't think the U.S. should consider use of force or economic coercion to take control over Greenland?
Sir, I don't think the United States should use any sort of coercive behavior toward a NATO ally, meaning Denmark.
Yeah, and because this has implications even beyond just Greenland, beyond just our conversations with Denmark. Do you think that the U.S. talking about potential use of force or not taking use of force off the table in places like Greenland and Panama, that weakens our arguments when we're criticizing or going against Russia and China for their infringements upon sovereignty in Ukraine and or maritime boundaries in the Indo-Pacific?
Sir, I think what's critical is that the United States, the comments I think you're referring to had to do, in my view, with making sure that nothing was off the table in terms of if an adversary were to gain access to key parts of the Western Hemisphere. And I don't think we can take anything off the table to prevent an adversary from gaining control of key choke points. I think obviously in terms of allies and partners, we would never want to use military force or coercive means.
When it comes to this decision that you're saying that we benefit from having a COFA, when we would benefit from having insular partnerships here on this front with insular areas, I guess I wanted to just understand, why does it have to be that route? So for instance, you talked about the Faroe Islands. Iceland is also up in that area. Would you recommend to us that we consider making offers to those places for those same offers of insular areas or a COFA?
I wouldn't, sir, mainly because they're not part of the Western Hemisphere. And I think this, if you look at the history of our relationship with Greenland, the history of our strategic concerns with Greenland, it's unique. And it really is, if you go back and look at the history of the United States in the World War I period, when we were negotiating with Denmark to retain, to purchase the Virgin Islands, one of the things that we did at that same period was we actually waived the Monroe Doctrine, one of the few times we've ever done this, and told the Danes that we had no objection to them gaining additional political control over Greenland, which wasn't fully established at the time, as part of our larger negotiations over purchase of the Virgin Islands. So this is clearly within the framework of the Monroe Doctrine, of hemispheric defense, of kind of traditional U.S. strategic conceptions of the outer perimeter of our hemisphere. I think this is very different from some of the examples you mentioned.
Well, I think Faroe Islands, Iceland, closer to the United States than Micronesia, Palau, other places where you said that we have COFA agreements to. I don't understand the difference.
Well, those, sir, I think are uniquely important because of their strategic location relative to the Indo-Pacific and relative to some of the scenarios that might be important for us in a military contingency. And you know that, I'm sure, the history of how we acquired those and why they continue to be so critical.
I guess what I'm just trying to get across here, and I also had conversations with Greenlanders over the course of the last week, is everything that we're saying here in this room, we're all in agreement that there's strategic value in Greenland. And we should be pushing forward on the icebreakers and so many other things that we should be doing. But I feel like we are getting in our own way by having this conversation about acquisition at a time when that's not even needed. I mean, I'll be honest with you, the Greenlanders I talked to were insulted that we were talking in this way about their own land, as if they're not even there, as if we can just purchase this and buy this, as if they are just an object. And that's what they said to me, that it feels like we're saying they are an object that we can just take because we are the richest, most powerful country in the world. So I just want to push back here because there's so much that we can be doing without having to own Greenland. So much more scientific partnerships, so much more that we can offer when it comes to minerals and mining. We should just be pushing forward in that regardless of what happens with a potential referendum going forward. So that if they do get to that place, we are already positioned ourselves as a strong partner. No doubt more we can do right now, but I just think that this is getting in our own way. And when you look at the polling, 85% of Greenlanders say they're opposed to becoming part of the US. 46% view President Trump's interests as a threat. If we are trying to solidify our relationship with them, especially in some post-independence position, we are burning those bridges. We are sowing sense of distrust right now that I think would make it even harder for us to be able to achieve that later. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Senator Marino. Dr. Pincus, there's been much discussion of late on Greenland, but I think what's underappreciated is something that you were trying to focus on, and that's the importance of Greenland to a whole host of U.S. strategic interests that are there. And obviously, yes, we need to develop a good working relationship, a good partnership with Greenland. You mentioned the Space Force base that's in Greenland. It's a critical forward operating location. It is the department's northernmost installation. It hosts radar systems that are essential to our missile defense. The comment was made that there could be flight paths of ICBMs over Greenland. Well, that may or may not happen, but what is key there is that no matter where in the Arctic ICBMs are flying, what we have to have is radars to be on Greenland so that not only can they track, but they can also detect any incoming threats. I'd also like to consider the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. And Mr. Gray, maybe you'd want to add some into this discussion as well. As we look at the increased Russian submarine activity there in recent years, and you couple that with the growing Chinese and Russia presence in the Arctic, I think it's hard to understate that gap's importance. So both of you, do you assess that increased U.S. presence in the GI-UK gap would be beneficial? Start with Dr. Pincus and then Mr. Gray, if you'd like to add.
Thank you very much, Senator, for that terrific question. I think it's very helpful to talk in terms of specifics. And in Greenland, we have long had radar installations to give us early warning of incoming ICBMs coming from Eurasia. And in the current era of hypersonics, new missiles, new missile delivery systems, it's very important that those radars remain in place and that we recapitalize and modernize them to give us as much advance notice as possible. So there's a big radar system at the Batufik base, there's a big airfield, there's a deep water port. On the east coast of Greenland, that is the westernmost point of that GI-UK gap. So it is a key point for monitoring Russian naval activity. I think we are looking at a set of challenges in the GI-UK gap related to Russian activity, undersea activity, that is a real problem set for us. The gap between Greenland, Iceland, the UK, also I would add Norway, provides us some really important points from which to support monitoring and activity. It would be best to talk to the Department of Defense in a classified setting about what specific capabilities and access they may need, but I will say that the 1951 Defense Agreement gives us very wide access to Greenland. We have never had a problem asking for access and permissions and not getting it. And both Greenland and Denmark have made it clear that they stand ready to have that conversation again. I think the Danish defense investments that have been announced include domain awareness capabilities and presence that will help us. There's certainly more that can be done, but I think being very specific about what the problem is helpful in terms of thinking about our appropriate response, and also recognizing that in an event of a contingency, fixed installations, whether it's a radar asset or an airfield, they would be taken out with long-range missile strikes. So, I would say that Russia doesn't have the capability to seize and hold Greenland, and nor would there be a strong military argument for it to do so, given that its most likely response in the event of a contingency would be to strike those assets and then keep moving on.
Which would also make it extremely important that DoD maintains that spectrum use to be able to identify what's coming in, not just for the homeland, but also for Greenland.
Absolutely, and I think having a conversation about air defense and, missile defense options. We do not have interceptors in Greenland. We do not have interceptors in Canada. We have them in Alaska. So I think there is a conversation to be had about that specific capability. Thank you.
Mr. Gray, before I get called out, please.
Thank you, Senator. So many of our concerns strategically about Greenland, going back to the 40s, have been about the GI-UK gap. And it's been a concern across multiple great power competitors. It is a concern today. To me, the question is less, Dr. Pink has made the comment about, militarily it would probably not be taken out. I'm more concerned about a future political arrangement in Greenland that could be influenced or controlled adversely by an adversary power in a way that would prevent us from being able to exercise the type of control or the type of domain awareness over the gap that we have had in recent years. That's why I think these proposals that I've mentioned, that others have put forward for what is the long-term political arrangement in connection with Greenland, it's so important because we have to have the ability to maintain some sort of control and some sort of awareness over that gap.
Thank you.
Senator Blunt Rochester.
Thank you for the recognition, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Cantwell, and for convening this hearing about our partnership with Greenland. Greenland is positioned near the next vital strategic region for the United States and our adversaries, the Arctic. As we all have discussed here today, Russia and China know well that the Arctic is important to controlling the flow of trade and global security, and they are increasing their economic and military activities in the region. That is why we must simultaneously strengthen our relationship with Denmark and Greenland while addressing the growing international threats to the region. Our alliance with Denmark and Greenland is critically important to our shared economic and national security. I'd like to focus my questions on our critical mineral supply chains. Greenland's strong natural resources offer economic opportunities for Greenland itself, for the United States, Denmark, and our allies. As Greenland's own Minister of Business has noted in a January 16th op-ed, Greenland has 39 of the 50 minerals we have classified as critical to national security. This is why supply chain resiliency is one of my top priorities. Ensuring the innovative industries in the U.S. and in the allied nations have the resources they need is critical for the expansion of good-paying jobs for Greenlanders and for a strong economy. And we really need to make sure that we put a fine point on the fact that we desperately need a national strategy for our supply chains, which is why I'm happy to be working in a bipartisan way with Senators Cantwell and Blackburn. Dr. Pincus, how would you say we can strategically leverage and work with Greenland on their abundant critical materials to enhance the resiliency of domestic industries, our domestic industries?
Thank you, ma'am, for that question. Greenland has abundant minerals. They have been discussed extensively by Mr. Marchese. I appreciate those facts. There are significant challenges bringing those minerals to market, and there are, as he's also discussed, there are conditions that increase the price. It's a harsh climate. There's very little infrastructure. And so companies operating in a market context are generally going to look elsewhere. And this is amplified by a global context in which mineral prices are volatile. And a mine is a long-term bet. We're talking a 20, 30, 40, 50-year bet. And under that current set of conditions where you have to spend a lot of money up front to develop a mine in Greenland, and you don't know what the prices are going to be in 20 years when your ores spit out, it's hard to justify that. That would require non-market interventions to overcome, whether it's government funding roads and infrastructure, providing grants or special investment vehicles to provide capital that is not available in the marketplace. That problem set exists in Alaska and also in the Canadian Arctic as well. The North American Arctic has abundant natural resources. They're in the United States' backyard. It's very tempting to construct those short supply chains. But the price challenges remain. And I think if we can find solutions to help overcome some of those challenges, our domestic supply lines would be much stronger. The environmental standards across North America are the highest in the world. The problem is solving for these non-market interventions that are required. And I think that is going to be an ongoing challenge, and we can think creatively about some new technological tools that could be brought to bear. About joint partnerships. Our allies are also interested in breaking China's stranglehold on critical minerals. So the extent to which we can find common solutions, I think that's terrific.
Are there any new initiatives that we should know about or consider?
I think we have agreements on minerals with a lot of our close allies, and that is something that can continue to be advanced. The U.S. government has taken important steps to, identify novel tools and make funding available. And I think if it was easy, we would have done it a long time ago. Mm-hmm. It's also important to remember that processing remains China's key stranglehold. There are critical minerals around the world, but China controls almost all of the processing chain. And we can't just secure access to minerals, we need to break their grip on processing.
Just to follow up on Senator Kim's points, I'm curious, in your opinion, in what ways can we build on our strong historic partnership with Greenland while respecting sovereignty and our commitment to our NATO allies?
I would echo what Mr. Gray has said about making this, putting Greenlanders at the center of this conversation and listening to them carefully. They very clearly want independence. They're interested in developing their minerals, but also are very concerned about environmental standards. The Greenlandic government took on the authority over natural resource decision-making in the 2009 Self-Government Act. So Greenlanders fought for the right to control their natural resources, and I think it is unlikely that they would be willing to cede that control. So as we move forward with this conversation about potential acquisition, I think, as Mr. Marchese mentioned, the importance of the regulatory authorities will continue to be at the center there.
Great. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Well, thank you. Now I recognize myself. So question for all of you, just a quick hits here. So start with you, Mr. Gray. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have called President Trump's desire to purchase Greenland a clickbait distraction. Yes or no, do you characterize this conversation as a clickbait distraction?
No, and it wasn't when Harry Truman or Andrew Johnson or Dwight Eisenhower did it either.
Okay, Mr. Marchese?
No, sir. We have a lot of mineral potential there, and it's certainly one of the options we have moving forward.
Dr. Mercer?
Thank you for that question, but I apologize, that's outside the purview of my agency.
Okay. Dr. Pincus?
Not at all. And I would note that President Trump's expressed interest in Greenland during his first administration yielded very significant steps forward in the U.S.-Greenland relationship. I would point to the reopening of our consulate in Nuuk as a landmark accomplishment that has done tremendous good for the U.S.-Greenland relationship. That was a direct result of his intervention as his first term. Thank you.
Perfect. So not a clickbait distraction. In fact, actually a very worthy conversation. So let me ask you again the same from the perspective of the 56,000 people who live in Greenland. Let me just point out that's basically the size of Westlake, Ohio, where I live, is the entire population of a country that is, sorry to say it to my colleague from Alaska, 50% bigger than Alaska. He likes to always point out how big Alaska is versus the rest of us. So, Mr. Gray, if you were a Greenlander, would you rather have be part of America, a $27 trillion economy, or part of Denmark, that's a $407 billion economy, given the strategic imperative, the cost of investment, the ability to yield money from the international markets, the ability to defend yourself against Russia and China, where this is going to become a strategic imperative? Who would you rather be on the side of there?
Well, Senator, I think the answer is obvious that it's the United States, but the question for me is not between Denmark and the United States. It's between the United States and China and Russia. And I think that answer is even more obvious. And your colleagues had mentioned something about sovereignty. To me, this is about preserving the sovereignty of the Greenlanders from countries, from adversary nations who have a long history of undermining just that type of sovereignty when our tradition has been to uphold and protect it.
And Mr. Marchese, if you think about, let's say Greenland became a sovereign, independent country, 56,000 people. How would it possibly be able to afford the kind of infrastructure improvements, mining operations, and the ability to provide for its own people as an island, literally and figuratively, financially?
Senator, by itself, first of all, it's obvious now that there isn't any, again, according to my purview, mining there. So clearly something needs to be done. I believe that part of the problem is the way this is being, I hate to use the word sold to the public. I don't think we're emphasizing enough of the benefits that the Greenlanders would get, specifically jobs. I mean, I believe when people say 85% are against it, I think part of the perception is it's a land grab and we're just going to impose our will upon them, versus trying to soften the image by saying, guys, and women, we're going to be giving you high-quality jobs. Mining jobs pay significantly more than average wages across the board. So I would be trying to emphasize the economic benefits to the population, because I don't believe that message has gotten through. But it is clear that without some form of U.S. intervention, that the Greenlanders by themselves just can't make. It's a $3.5 billion GDP. That's smaller than some of the mines in the world. So they need help.
Yeah, I mean, I'll close with this. It strikes me that to my colleagues on the Democrat side, and look, I've had an entire almost 6-week term in the United States Senate, so as the new guy on the block, it strikes me that the knee-jerk reaction of anything that President Trump says has to be met with a complete irrational response that it's bad before ever even processing it is what prevents us from getting great things done. I mean, I think at the end of the day, what we should do is recognize that we have a commander-in-chief that knows the difference between Greenland and Greenville, and that is actually capable of putting a deal together that is his actual forte. And if we can put a deal together where the United States of America can acquire Greenland and the people of Greenland are happy, it should be an absolutely bipartisan attitude, and I hope that my colleagues will get there. And I will yield my time and then recognize our senator from Michigan, who did not win the National Football Championship this year.
Thank you, Senator Moreno. That is true, but the University of Michigan is always very excited to beat Ohio State. That is really the only game that matters every year for Michigan. Before getting to my questions, I want to first share that I recently had the pleasure of speaking with the ambassador of Denmark and the head of representation from Greenland to discuss our long history of military and economic cooperation. Greenland and Denmark are steadfast in their commitment to prioritizing collaboration with allies like the United States, whether that's through increased coordination related to critical minerals, partnering on scientific research or navigating the security concerns that are very real in the Arctic. And certainly that's why I find it troubling that while our ally is aggressively and actively seeking increased partnership with the United States, we have President Trump that insists on purchasing land that is, let's be very clear, it's not for sale. It's just simply not for sale. The president suggested that the United States needs to own Greenland to defend our national security is wrong. In fact, threatening our NATO allies really in this fashion undermines our shared mission to work together as allies to counter both Russia and Chinese footholds in the Arctic as well as around the world. Our strength as a country is economic, it's military, but it's also our friends and allies, which are incredibly important for national security. Despite his emphasis on the strategic importance of the Arctic, President Trump has already threatened to upend our economy and our relationship with another Arctic ally with tariffs against Canada. And in recent events with the proposed tariffs, Canada did give commitments that they had already agreed to. Let's be clear, the Canadians already agreed to do the things that Donald Trump threatened and then said, oh, I'll release the tariffs, even though we just got what Canada has already done in terms of investing in enhanced border security, something I feel passionate about. So I'm concerned we're seeing the same thing here. Reckless foreign policy and economic policy ideas that really have no benefits for Americans and distract us from what we really need to be focused on. So I'm disappointed that today we have to address another ill-advised Trump administration move against an ally instead of focusing on improving our strategic coordination against those who do not share our values or our goals. So with that, I have a few questions. First off, Dr. Pincus, Michigan certainly knows the importance of maintaining our Coast Guard's ice-breaking fleet. Great Lakes icebreakers are designed to extend the operating season in Great Lakes ports, and they keep our shipping lanes open throughout a longer season than would otherwise happen. As we've discussed today, the rapidly changing Arctic landscape marked by melting ice and increased accessibility means that icebreakers are going to play an even more pivotal role to maintain shipping in the Arctic. So my question for you is, given the growing competition from our adversaries, not our allies, our adversaries in the Arctic, what challenges do you believe we need to overcome to increase our icebreaker fleet?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. We have significant challenges with U.S. icebreaking. Our fleet is at perhaps its lowest historical point, and that is a weakness that is being exploited by our adversaries. We see Chinese icebreakers in the Arctic every year now, and I don't think that's a surprise. I will say that the challenges we face with regards to icebreaking are not unique to icebreakers. They are symptomatic of the broader problems plaguing U.S. shipbuilding as a whole. The Wilson Center has undertaken extensive stakeholder consultation on these issues. What we have heard is basically this: government is a bad partner to do business with. The industry in the U.S. and beyond faces a list of challenges: availability and stability of funding for shipbuilding, competition for skilled labor. It is hard to build an icebreaker. It takes unique welding expertise, for example, and inefficient trade barriers. Government clients are risk avoidant and let perfection be the enemy of progress. So I think while we have some major comparative advantages over China, particularly in our strong network of alliances, we can leverage those more effectively to improve icebreaker construction. I would flag the Ice Pact, which is a trilateral agreement between the US, Canada, and Finland to cooperate on the production of polar icebreakers and potentially also Great Lakes icebreakers, as having potential to leverage allied expertise. And this may have carry-on effects across shipbuilding more broadly.
Great, great. Dr. Mercer, I know that both Arctic and Antarctic research requires collaboration across a number of government agencies, and that this research is absolutely key to our understanding as to how to operate in those regions. So my question to you is, in addition to the economic and security importance of the Coast Guard's role in overseeing our icebreaker fleet, which we just talked about, could you discuss the role that the Coast Guard plays in supporting NSF work and how important that is to support?
Absolutely. We have a very strong working relationship with the Coast Guard, both in the North and the South. And in the North, NSF actually funds all the science capability on the Healy, as well as the technicians that operate the science capability on the Healy. We also fund a lot of research that happens aboard the Healy. So for example, when it was transiting from Alaska over to Greenland, north of Russia. We had active research on that cruise last year.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for being here. Mr. Gray, I want to come to you. Many of us have seen what China has done in Africa, around Djibouti, with the port that is there, and also in Latin America. And we have listened to Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership talk about the Polar Silk Road and putting this as a part of their Belt and Road initiative. So I'd like for you to talk about why it is important that we strengthen this bond with Greenland and pay more attention to this because of the impact of the CCP.
Senator, it's a great question. This is a playbook that the Chinese Communist Party run. They do it all over the world. I've seen it personally in the South Pacific. They do it in Latin America. They do it in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. They start by, you could call it the Belt and Road Initiative, you can call it the Polar Silk Road, whatever terminology they want to use. But what it is predatory lending, primarily usurious interest rates for what we often call white elephant projects, projects that very often serve no economic purpose.
And don't last. And then they're stuck with debt diplomacy.
Exactly. And once they have the debt diplomacy, ma'am, the Chinese come in and use that as for coercive political control over small developing states that can't push back and don't have the ability to counter the CCP's malign influence. And what I'm so concerned about and why I think this topic is so critical is that something very similar we're beginning to see bits and pieces of this in the High North, in the Faroe Islands, in Greenland to some extent in recent years. We've seen it in Svalbard. We've seen it in Iceland. This is beginning to happen. The Chinese are signaling their intention to pursue this more actively, and that's why because we know the playbook, we need to be prepared to push back proactively.
Dr. Pincus, I want to come to you because I had seen a quote from Biden NSC Council Director Brennan, and he made a comment at a Wilson Center event in 22 that the U.S. has accepted that the China has a, and I'm quoting him, vested interest in the Arctic. I completely disagree with that because China, just because they're calling themselves a near Arctic neighbor, does not give them a vested interest. And I want you to talk a little bit about that type attitude with that perspective that China is using this for their security and endangering our national security.
Thank you, Senator, for that question. China has expressed its interests in the Arctic with an Arctic policy statement that came out in 2018, and they mention a host of interests that they have in the region. They talk about the emergent shipping lanes, they talk about natural resources, they talk about scientific data, and so those are their articulated interests in the region. And I think it's, in terms of their economic interests, China is a resource importing country. There's a lot of resources in the Arctic region. It is not surprising that they would pursue those resources. Their pursuit of those resources is adverse to the interests of the United States.
Okay, Mr. Gray, I want to pivot to you on this because China focuses on dual-use technologies. And of course, we don't know where the China Economic Development Department, MOFCOM, ends, pardon me, and their military begins. And this is what they couch as dual use. And I would like for you to give what you see as specific steps that we can take against the CCP in this regard to stop them from using this as a research and test site.
It's an incredibly important question, Senator. I think this is where my concerns about the current trajectory of the political relationship between Denmark and Greenland are so acute. We have to have a plan for this, the reason you outline, and for reasons of even more conventional military purposes. We have to have a plan for what comes next. And if we don't know what the 56,000 people in Nuuk, what their political organization looks like post-Copenhagen, which they say will happen, what you're describing is going to become even more prevalent. And we've seen this happen in places in the South Pacific that are similarly sized. We have to have a plan for what comes next.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I'd now like to recognize Mr. Sullivan, who also is going to preside while I run down to the floor and vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this very important hearing. You know, the Arctic issues are something that, as the senator representing the only Arctic state in the country, I care deeply about, so appreciate the chairman focusing on this. You know, I want to first mention, I think the idea of the president looking to purchase Greenland has already been mentioned by a number of the panelists. Other presidents have thought about this. I think it's a wonderful idea if we can pull it off. Truman, Andrew Johnson, others did. But I also think it's important to remember, this is an op-ed I wrote in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago, saying, hey, Greenland's nice, good to go if we can get it, but remember our Arctic state, Alaska, because everything that people talk about with regard to Greenland, we have in spades already in America. It's called Alaska. Arctic location, strategic and critical minerals, oil and gas, cornerstone of America's missile defense. It's all there. The problem is, as the panelists know, when Democrats get in power, Biden was the latest example, they want to turn Alaska into a national park, not recognizing our state for what it is, which is a strategic crown jewel for America. The father of the U.S. Air Force, General Billy Mitchell, in testimony before Congress in the mid-1930s called Alaska the most strategic place on the planet. And it is. So that's what we're focused on. Don't forget Alaska. Fortunately, unlike President Biden, President Trump has already made it very clear that he's not going to forget Alaska. On day one, the president signed an executive order called Unleashing Alaska's Extraordinary Resource Potential. And I want to thank President Trump and his team for doing that. It goes into everything that this hearing has talked about. Strategic minerals, oil and gas, natural gas, getting the military involved. We just introduced my legislation called the Iron Dome Act, which is all about missile defense. Alaska is the cornerstone of our country's missile defense, and we can build that out even better. So appreciate what President Trump is already doing on Alaska. But it's not as if our adversaries don't recognize the strategic importance of Alaska or the Arctic. Next slide. This is what doesn't make a lot of news in the lower 48. In the last 3 years, we have had an enormous amount of Russian incursions into our airspace, America's airspace, Alaska's, it is, naval incursions into our EEZ, and just in the past year, these are some depictions of this. This is another slide we have. This gives you all the Russian, Chinese joint strategic bomber incursions into our ADIZ, and very disturbingly, joint naval task force into our EEZ. So our adversaries clearly understand the Arctic. Can you put that other slide up there? Just the one you had before, Scott. Yeah, perfect. So that's a wind-up to a question I want to ask the panelists. Mr. Gray, why don't we start with you? Given this, right, how important is America's Arctic? I've been talking to Secretary Hegseth, President, others, and Alaska, not just for missile defense, but to push back on what is clearly happening. We had a meeting on what we're going to be doing on the border, a lot of discussion with the President's team on the northern border. This is the northern border, and our adversaries are all over it. And in my view, what we need is a lot more infrastructure, a lot more military, a lot more missile defense, a lot more unleashing Alaska's critical minerals, oil and gas, and we couldn't have a better partner right now with President Trump. And the contrast between him and President Biden, who wanted to make my state a national park, he issued 70 executive orders, 70, singularly focused on Alaska to shut us down. President Trump's wiped that out. But what's your sense on how we need to respond to this in America's Arctic, which is Alaska, and the potential that Greenland could add to this, because that's the other part of the Arctic, not the Alaska part of the Arctic?
Senator, it's incredibly important. I think we have to look at our hemisphere holistically, from the Aleutians to Greenland, from pole to pole, and have and President Trump began this process in his first term, this holistic Arctic strategy that I was pleased to be involved in. We have to, from a military standpoint, we've talked about icebreakers, but we have to—
By the way, just real quick on icebreakers, Russia has 54, some of which are nuclear, many of which are weaponized. We have 2, and 1 is broken. You think that's peace through strength when it comes to icebreakers? It isn't. Continue, sorry to interrupt you.
It's obviously, the icebreakers are key, particularly when we think about what the adversaries are doing, nuclear-powered icebreakers, growing their fleet. When we think about the limited limited C-130 capacity that we have now for Arctic takeoff and landings, when we think about just the general attrition of Arctic warfighting capabilities since the end of the Cold War and the lack of investment in them, I know DoD will likely have its own Arctic strategy. We have to have Arctic warfighting capacity and deterrence as a much higher level priority. And I think your chart and what your state's dealing with is a perfect example of why.
Great. I'm going to turn to Senator Schmidt here. I know cares about these issues as well, and then I'll have some follow-up questions if there are no other senators coming back. So, Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Senator. For 80 years, nearly 80 years, the United States has provided the security blanket that has kept NATO allies safe. Yet when President Trump raised valid concerns about Greenland's security, NATO talked about protecting Greenland not against Russia, not against China, but against the United States. That is totally absurd. The reality is that President Trump's messaging is about defending not just America, but also our NATO allies against Russian and Chinese aggression. The reality is the real threat in the Arctic is Russia and China, and it is growing. Russia has reactivated Soviet-era bases, expanded its nuclear icebreaker fleet, and sent submarines into Greenlandic waters, one of which was only detected by chance. China, despite being 900 miles away, calls itself a near-Arctic state and is using its polar Silk Road to expand its influence over Greenland's infrastructure. Despite these mounting threats, Denmark has failed to provide adequate security for Greenland. The island's 27,000 miles of coastline remain largely unmonitored, and foreign vessels repeatedly enter its waters unchecked. The U.S. cannot afford to sit back while others neglect these responsibilities. The Arctic is a key frontier in global competition, and Greenland is central to U.S. security. Whether we acquire Greenland, increase military presence, economic investment, or formalize security arrangements, we must ensure Greenland's future aligns with U.S. interests, not Beijing's and not Moscow's. Whether through increased military presence, economic investment, or formalized security arrangements, we must act now to secure the Arctic for ourselves and our allies. So with that, I did want to ask Mr. Gray, I mentioned the Polar Silk Road. How would you compare that to the One Belt, One Road initiative?
Senator, I think of it as just the Arctic polar adjunct of Belt and Road. I think it's just, we know the playbook, as I said to Senator Blackburn, this is what the Chinese do to gain economic and then coercive political influence. It's the same playbook with a different name.
And as we've seen in other places around the world, when they build a grid, they can turn it on or they can turn it off. They build an airport and you're critical of the CCP, all of a sudden you don't have flights anymore. I mean, this is incredibly dangerous in a place like Greenland, which, by the way, is also part of the discussion about Panama and the Panama Canal, right? This having China control both ports on either end of that canal is incredibly dangerous for us from a military perspective and an economic perspective. Mr. Marchese, did I pronounce that right?
Close enough, Marquez.
Close enough, sorry. I apologize. I did want to ask you about, you may have mentioned this before, the potential economic value of that mineral wealth. And in this broader discussion we have about supply chains and having them, not being reliant on China, how valuable is that to the United States and the freedom-loving world?
Well, Senator, it's extremely valuable, but as I mentioned, sir, it will take, in my opinion, significant capital from the United States in order to get private industry. The United States should not be in the business of operating critical mineral resources. So it should, in my opinion, be the private sector, but it will take, in my opinion, significant incentives for the private sector, not necessarily, well, the significance of the upfront money would be to de-risk or somewhat help de-risk these projects. It's all about risk and reward. That's why, if you look at the map today, there are very few projects that are in existence. It's just the uncertainty of what's really there.
So in the half a minute I have left, what specifically, I mean, you started to sort of outline that. What is it, if we wanted to endeavor and we had a sort of working with them, what steps would we take to move forward on that?
Well, Senator, the first thing we have to do is actually, like anything, identify what's there. We have, at this point, just literally scratched the surface of what's there. The sampling that's been done just indicates this is there. What we don't know is how much of it is there, the grade of what is there, how difficult it is to, and when I say difficult, the level of difficulty it is to process these materials. So there's a lot of unanswered questions which the average private company just is not in a position to undertake. And the very largest mining companies, they're risk averse. These are not individuals that are accustomed to what I would call high risk investment. So it takes a different mindset when you're going into a country like Greenland than, for example, staying in the United States.
Well, one of the things I think has been the hallmark of President Trump's foreign policy, and certainly what I believe in, is identifying what are our core national interests. I think this era of adventurism is over. What are the core interests of the United States of America? And I think Greenland sits sort of front and center with that. So I appreciate the conversation and the hearing today. Thank you.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Dr. Pincus, several Colorado institutions are actively conducting research to advance the Department of Defense's 24 Arctic strategy. Center for National Security Initiatives at CU Boulder launched into sensing technology, energy, cybersecurity. The Center for Combat Medicine and Battlefield Research at the Medical Center at CU Anschutz is taking a leadership looking at Arctic casualty care for warfighting that's there. Dr. Pincus, how can we continue to foster partnerships between the Department of Defense and the academic and research community on these, to support these national security efforts in the Arctic?
Thank you, Senator, for that question, and I appreciate you flagging the strong connections and support between the Department of Defense and our research and academic institutions, which has played out particularly in the polar regions. Both the Arctic and Antarctica have long been places where there's been close cooperation between U.S. science institutes and the U.S. military And that has redounded to the benefit of the United States. We have world-leading scientific capacities. We have a technology-based economy, and that comes out of decades of support for basic science and research, and also, all of the tech spin-offs that come out of that. And so I think, you've listed a couple of examples of research efforts that are likely to provide economic benefits as well as military advantages. I think that's always been very important. Militaries must constantly innovate to dominate. And, the polar regions are places where that's especially true given their unique challenges.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. And certainly, I remember 30-some years ago, some of the scientific research into the Arctic was derided as being useless. And the scope of history requires us to keep looking and being curious. I had a friend who was a geologist who cross-country skied across Greenland in 1985. It's pretty flat, at least until you get to the coast. Dr. Mukasey, obviously we talked about the critical and rare earth minerals that are at Greenland. However, as you've mentioned, they're mostly locked in the ice. The cold weather and winter mining, I mean, you really can't do it too much in the winter there, it's so cold. The U.S., one of our great advantages against China and Russia has always been our allies, our network of alliances and partners, many of whom have extensive mining experience. Canada, excuse me, Canada obviously has a lot of experience in coal mining, Japan, seafloor mining. How might the new critical mineral mining ventures in Greenland benefit from that shared expertise?
Good question, Senator. Unfortunately, most of the downstream, which is the processing capabilities in the world, are located in Southeast Asia, and specifically China. China prohibits their researchers and professionals from doing this in other countries. So even if Greenland, in an alternative universe, if the United States said, hey, we want your help, they wouldn't give it to us just because it's prohibited. There is expertise in Africa, there's expertise in South America, but again, it depends on the type of mining you're referring to. So for example, there is significant expertise around the world in base metals. So copper, aluminum, things like that, no problem finding expertise anywhere.
Right.
When you start getting into the critical mineral area, as I said, most in Southeast Asia, but specifically some in Europe. So they, in my opinion, would have the expertise available, but in
I get
limited.
it. I understand what you're saying. It's,
Yeah,
it's complex. It's not easily accessible.
Yes.
Got it. Dr. Mercer, as you know, Arctic research in remote, austere environments through the National Science Foundation, through NOAA, requires, again, close collaboration with our partners, our allies. The funding freeze issued by the Office of Management and Budget could really disrupt some of these research efforts. In the Bipartisan CHIPS and Science Act, the Congress directed the NSF to create an Office of Research, Security, and Policy, responsible for identifying and addressing security risks that impact research integrity of the U.S. projects. In your view, does the increasing presence of China and Russia in the Arctic region show or create any new research security risks that Congress should be especially vigilant about?
Thank you for your question. The Office of Polar Programs in NSF works in close partnership with our Office of the Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy. NSF is also a member of the National Counterintelligence Task Force to work with the intelligence community and law enforcement partners on research security issues. It's something we take very seriously. But as far as the rest of your question, I'd be happy to take that back to NSF and potentially arrange a conversation in a different setting.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I yield back to the chair.
Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. I'd like to begin with critical minerals and trade, building on some of my colleague, Mr. Hickenlooper's questions. The headlines have recently been focused on acquisition of Greenland under different scenarios. But what I actually find more plausible and therefore more interesting is some sort of trade relationship that might be deepened. Greenland holds vast reserves, as we know, of critical minerals and sits outside of China's supply chain dominance. And I think a trade partnership with Greenland could strengthen our mineral security in the fairly near term. Let me know if I'm wrong on that predicate. But I also think that without investment in processing, we risk repeating some past mistakes that we've made in terms of these trade relations. A smarter approach might be to go beyond extraction and ensure that trade agreements support investment in refining, processing, and manufacturing to work together with our counterparties and build a resilient supply chain rather than shifting dependencies. We know that trade deals alone won't solve our problems, but they will certainly make great strides towards reducing our dependencies. Without addressing permitting delays and infrastructure gaps at home, even the best agreements could take years to deliver real results. So, Mr. Marchese, Mr. Marchese, close.
Marchese.
Okay, I'm sorry, sir. If a trade agreement were to be considered with Greenland, what specific policy incentives should be included to ensure that rare earth elements aren't just extracted, but also processed and refined in a way that strengthens U.S. supply chains?
Senator, great question. I will disagree with you somewhat, though.
Please.
I believe we risk making the same mistakes in Greenland as we have in the United States, which is the federal government provides a lot of potential financial assistance for downstream processing. So process to your heart's content will help you. But finding sources, which is, as I mentioned in my testimony, upstream, zero money available.
Yes.
In my opinion, significantly easier to get funding once you have the upstream part solved. Finding the mine, developing the mine,
right,
in my mind, is significantly more important than processing it. You get lots of money. There's lots of people that would give you capital to process something, but you have to have the supply to begin with. And in this country, we don't provide money for exploration and discovery. In our alternate universe, we'd love to have every other country deliver material so we can process it.
So I'm learning, Mr. Marchese. I'm learning from you. You're familiar with some of the solutions that are offered here on the Hill. One has been to, and this has been spearheaded by Senator Cornyn, to work with our friends around the world and our U.S. Geological Service to identify where all the mineral reserves are, and then do our best to project out into the future demands for those various minerals and processing capacity, and just kind of map all this stuff out as one would do when you're managing a project. Is that the sort of assistance that might help take some risk out of the markets and unlock more private capital?
Senator, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, it's called mineral characterization. We absolutely need to do that first in order to allow a private company, and mostly smaller companies. As I said, larger companies are risk averse.
Yes.
They'll pay you handsomely to buy something from you once you've developed it for them, but we're not at that point. So we need smaller, typically the smaller companies are going to be coming in to do this type of exploration. They just don't have the capital, to undertake these. So yes, in my opinion.
Maybe that paired with something I was alluding to, again, I'm not suggesting that all would be sufficient, but collectively, would that be constructive towards reducing our dependency?
Senator, yes. As long as we had upstream as well as downstream funding, I think we're on the right track.
Very helpful. Thank you. If I could just ask one more question related to ice breaking. Mr. Gray, can you describe how our lack of multiple functional icebreakers affects our influence in the Arctic region, just for my constituents? Yes.
Well, Senator, it just limits our capacity to go where we need to go when we need to go. It limits deterrence, it limits presence, it limits our ability to have domain awareness of critical sea lanes, and it cedes the key seaways to adversaries who are making those investments, China and Russia, who are building the world's largest icebreaker fleets, including nuclear icebreakers.
And not just military. It doesn't just cede the military playing field to them. It cedes the commercial. Is that accurate?
It does. And what I would say, though, on the Chinese particularly, I think the commercial is oftentimes a predicate for future military activity, and that they're intricately linked in the Chinese context.
As Mr. Mahan said they would be.
Absolutely.
Linked. Right. Okay, Chairman, thank you.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I just want to point out again that Denmark and Greenland have made clear that Greenland is not for sale. And this hearing thus on the acquisition of Greenland and the problems it's causing with our allies seems strange to me when we just got the report that the inflation is going up, and I think we should be more focused on those things, but I'm happy to dive in. Being from a state that has a lot of snow and having been to Greenland, I'd love to talk about this. As my Republican colleague, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, said in a joint statement with a member of the Danish Parliament, the future does not require us to redraw the borders on the map, but to work harder than ever to cross them. Dr. Pincus, do you agree that strengthening our alliances advance U.S. strategic objectives in the region?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I would say that from a policy analytic perspective, the U.S. has clearly defined national interests in Greenland and across the Arctic, and we have identified some challenges and some problems that we are turning our attention to. We have a range of policy options, and I think it is the job of the President and the Congress of policymakers to make those policy determinations, balancing relative priority, risk, and cost. So again, with regards to Greenland, we have a range of options, and there's a spectrum in there. And I think at the lower cost, a sort of lower hurdle part of that spectrum, I would put diplomatic arrangements, treaties, defense agreements.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm concerned about the freezing, since we're talking about freezing lands, freezing of federal grants and assistance that can seriously harm our global competitive advantage, including in the Arctic. For instance, the National Science Foundation's Office of Polar Programs guides critical research on Arctic issues. For example, the University of Minnesota's Polar Geospatial Center has been working on digital mapping with support, which is going to be really important as we look at what's happening with Russia and other countries that are not our friends, China, that are heading there. What role, Dr. Mercer, can the university research community play in preparing the U.S. for future civilian and military operations in the Arctic region?
Thank you for that question. America is the world's leader in scientific research, and our work, NSF's work, or the work that we support in the Arctic, including that of the University of Minnesota and the Polar Geospatial Center, is really important to the U.S. As I noted before, we're strong collaborators with other U.S. government agencies, including various Department of Defense services, and as well as the government of Greenland. So I think that those relationships between academia and the various government institutes that further research in the Arctic are really important.
Okay. Dr. Pincus, different topic, icebreakers, big deal for the Great Lakes, and as you can imagine. Last November, Canada, Finland, and the U.S. formalized the Icebreaker Collaboration Effort Pact, known as the Ice Pact, very creative, to build more icebreaker ships, essential tools to open trade routes. I've talked to representatives of both countries outside of the U.S., Canada, and Finland about this. How can we maximize our collaboration with Canada and Finland in the Arctic? And I know you share my concerns about slow momentum for building in the U.S. What can more be done to boost the domestic manufacturing? So first question on Finland, Canada. Second one is what we can do here besides getting more icebreakers in conjunction with them. And maybe that's the answer. So.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. The Wilson Center has been consulting extensively on the ICE Pact and on icebreaker construction, and there are a number of hurdles here. And they include labor and workforce challenges. There's a shrinking talent pool, and shipyards are competing for skilled labor. We do not have a national shipbuilding strategy or unified shipbuilding plan to help align yards and ships for best fit. Our contracting practices are often adverse for business interests. For example, we often use firm fixed price contracts on first-in-class ships and vessels, and that places all of the risk on a shipyard. Our specifications and requirements are often permit perfection to be the enemy of the good. And so I think there's a lot of things that we could do and lessons that we could learn from our foreign counterparts in terms of leveraging their expertise and speeding up our acquisition. But one point I do want to make is that the Coast Guard cannot just get more hulls. Yes, we need a lot more icebreakers, but they also need people and they need funding to run those hulls. We see with the recent acquisition of the Storis that it is going to be years before it comes into operational capacity because of the refits that it's going to need. And the Coast Guard is under strain now with demand for its mission set. We're seeing challenges meeting all of those demands. There's strains placed on people and families. This is true for the Navy as well. The world wants the Coast Guard to be in a lot of places and the Navy to be in a lot of places. And so I think we need hulls, but we also need people.
And how do you see the last question, the ICE Pact working with Canada and Finland and helping?
I think it's a little too soon to say there is tremendous potential there, but the implementation is going to be the real challenge right now. We have plans in place, but there haven't been resources appropriated to support the implementation of ICE Pact. So I think DHS and Coast Guard are working through some of those challenges, and it will be interesting to see if we can make some creative solutions around relaxing trade restrictions, perhaps permitting in skilled labor that could help us build icebreakers faster, perhaps relaxing some ITAR restrictions on tech sharing. So I think there's a lot of ways for innovation, but we have to pick our targets and again, apply that sort of range of analysis. What's the top priority? Where are we willing to accept some risk and pay some cost? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I'm going to just wrap up with a few more questions for the panel here. First, going back to this chart, I want to get a sense of why do you think this has been a pretty dramatic increase from Russia and China in unprecedented joint naval and strategic bomber task forces into our airspace, into our water, EEZ. And related to that, Mr. Gray, you talked about presence. You can't have presence without infrastructure. I think it's high time that we start looking at more infrastructure to be able to address this. We're going to have a hearing with the NORTHCOM commander on the Armed Services Committee tomorrow, and I'm going to talk a lot about looking at potential bases. There's an incredible Navy base out here. The ADAC Naval Base was closed during BRAC. That could be a great sub base, Naval Air Station base, surface warship base, huge refueling capacity right there, flanking the Russians, Chinese, very strategic. We're trying to get a strategic port built in Nome, Alaska. But otherwise, we have very little infrastructure from which to launch military, economic, icebreaker capabilities. So maybe just a quick question for all the panelists. Do we need more infrastructure in America's Arctic? And now I'm not talking Greenland. This hearing's about strategic interests in the Arctic. We're an Arctic nation solely because of that great state, Alaska. So what's your sense for all the panelists on infrastructure in the Arctic to combat what is a very, very aggressive move by our adversaries? And by the way, just talking to the NORTHCOM commander, we had one of the busiest times ever in terms of aggressive incursions, joint Chinese-Russian operations. That's unprecedented. He thinks this year it's going to be even more. So we got to be ready. For America, protecting America, right now, what's the sense of the panel on infrastructure in America's Arctic?
Senator, I couldn't agree more. We have to have more infrastructure, not just from a defensive presence standpoint to protect our homeland, but also from a power projection standpoint. We've allowed our Arctic infrastructure, in addition to a lot of our just our general defense industrial infrastructure, to atrophy. I think this would be a huge way to boost our capacity to deter in the Arctic.
Great. Mr. Marchese, do you have a view on that, sir?
Senator, I couldn't agree with you more. You're preaching to the converted. We, in my opinion, need significant more infrastructure spending, not only in Alaska, but in the United States. You know, there's nothing wrong with fishing at your feet. I mean, we have everything we need here. It's great that we're going to Greenland, but let's concentrate on what we can control, which is United States investment.
Great.
Thank you.
Dr. Mercer.
Thank you for the question, sir. As I said before, America is the world's leader in scientific research, and that's certainly true in the polar regions. We rely on heavily, in order to be the leader in research in the polar regions, on the Coast Guard icebreakers, the LC-130 aircraft, the C-17 aircraft, the space-based Patufic in Greenland, and as I noted in my opening testimony, we're in the process of in the design process to recapitalize and modernize Summit Station at the center of the Greenland ice sheet.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Pincus.
Thank you, Senator. I agree that we are seeing increased adversary presence in the region because they perceive weakness on their part, and so they're pressing us.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not on this chart. I have another one that shows I think some of the witnesses said this earlier, they're building up their infrastructure, particularly military, but also energy and critical mineral infrastructure in a huge way in the Arctic, and we're still kind of, I agree, kind of exuding weakness.
But I would also note that we face multiple challenges in Alaska. In addition to extending and expanding our presence there, we have challenges with coastal erosion and some of the permafrost issues, so there's money that needs to be put into current DoD installations to harden them. We're also seeing the expansion of wildland fires and other novel challenges. So I think efficient spending decisions to get as much bang for our buck is important so we can meet the full range of national security through economic and community concerns related to that really wide range of challenges. So, I would put the Coast Guard at the top of the list because it's got a broad mission set and its assets can be utilized for a lot of different purposes. Obviously, DoD assets can be applied to civil disasters as well. And then new technology that can help us respond effectively and juggle competing demands, whether it's from a massive wildfire, a big coastal storm, like some of the storms we've seen in Western Alaska, or military challenges. We have to do all of those at the same time. So it's a real big problem set, and I appreciate you flagging it.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, listen, we're going to be working on this. Our budget reconciliation plan here on the Senate side is going to have a lot of resources for our military, for the border, by the way, the northern border as well as the southern border, and the Coast Guard. And I think that's going to be welcomed, hopefully in a bipartisan way. But listen, I want to thank the witnesses. This has been a great hearing. The issue of the Arctic is a really important one. Appreciate the chairman putting this on the agenda really early in his tenure. Senators will have until close of business on Wednesday, February 19th, to submit additional questions for the record from our witnesses. We respectfully request the witnesses to try to get those back by Wednesday, March 5th. To respond to questions for the record. Again, thank you. Great panel today. A lot of interest, as you can see, in a bipartisan way on Greenland, on the Arctic. We got a lot more work to do. This committee stands adjourned.